so calling together the June 15th Creeks and Water Quality Improvement Citizens Advisory Committee. It's Wednesday, June 15th, and if we could do roll call, please.
Mr. Moldiva? Here. Mr. Bullock? Here. Mr. Smith? Here. Miss French? Here. Miss Lomas? Here. Miss Weber? Here. Miss Marroquin? Thank you. Mr. Jordan? Here. And Mr. Casebeer?
Here.
Thank you. And I hope we all have had a chance to approve the minutes from last month's May 18th meeting.
Move to accept as submitted.
I'll second that.
Do you have any questions or comments on that? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Are there any adjustments to tonight's agenda?
No adjustments, Mr. Chair. Just one announcement to make. I wanted to introduce Annie Marroquin, who is our new youth intern appointee to the Creeks Advisory Committee. She was appointed about 3 weeks ago by the City Council, and her role with the committee will be to not only learn about governance-related matters, but to provide a youth perspective on the issues that come before the Creeks Advisory Committee. So I wanted to introduce Ms. Marroquin, and she may have a couple of things she wants to tell the committee and give her a little bit of background about herself, and I'll turn it over to her to do that.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah, I am going to be a senior at Dos Pueblos High School. I'm also part of the youth council, so I kind of get the feel for these meetings as well. And I definitely see a future in my future working with the environment in any kind of way. I don't know where yet, but I definitely know I really want to do it because it's one of my passions. So why not start now and kind of enjoy these opportunities that Santa Barbara offers. So I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for welcoming me in a very nice way. So thank you.
All right, very nice. Thank you. Good way to spend your summers. All right, so there's some members of the public here. Anyone would like to have any public comment tonight? No. All right, moving on. Item number 6, committee member and staff communications.
I don't have anything, Mr. Chair.
Oh, okay, great. So then let's get down to business. Number 7 is the Dr. Murray is going to be giving us a program update on water quality research and monitoring. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Am I? Okay. Tonight I'm going to give a biannual update on our water quality monitoring program, and we produce quarterly reports, and those reports are on our website. So I'm going to go very briefly through a few our goals and then a few highlights of some of the work we've been doing. There's a lot more information, especially for some of the new members in our reports, or you can call me anytime, and I'm happy to discuss the issues. And then I'll finish with some recommendations for changes to our fiscal year 12 research plan, and then we'll take a vote for you to move forward with that. Okay, so for our research and monitoring program, we collect samples all throughout the city, all of our creeks, different storm drains, lagoons. Sometimes we produce simulated runoff and collect it right off the streets. We're really all over the city. We always collect our samples in a way that's question-driven. We're always trying to stay attentive to our research questions. We're not just collecting data for data's sake. And those questions are formed around supporting the goals of understanding how much pollution is out there in our creeks and watersheds, what are the impacts, what types of pollution, what are the impacts of that pollution to aquatic organisms and human recreational users. We are trying to evaluate the effectiveness of the water quality projects we've put in and those we have planned in the future. When we do find problems with pollution, trying to find sources and how those pollutants are getting into the creeks. And we're constantly, every year, kind of updating either in a minor or major way. It's been a couple years since we've had a major update, and we'll suggest some minor tweaks this year. And kind of organize our sampling into several different elements. We do kind of routine watershed assessment, storm monitoring. I already talked about projects, beach water quality, source tracking. We do creek walks, bioassessment, which you had a presentation on recently, and continuing methods development. So I'll move on to focusing on some of our results from sediment testing in fiscal year 11. And we've several years ago, the committee expressed concern that we might have pollutants that are accumulating, even though they might be at low concentrations in stormwater runoff and in the creek water, that they might be accumulating on sediment grains and in the mud. And when that happens year after year, it can accumulate to high concentrations that can cause toxicity in the sediment themselves, or when that sediment is stirred up during a rainstorm. And so for 3 years, we tested out at the lagoons, at the outfalls for our major creeks, trying to integrate the effects across the watershed. And mostly pollutants were at low concentrations, and any toxicity testing we did showed no toxicity problems in those sediments. But we did have hits of a new emerging class of pesticide called pyrethroids. They're replacing some of the banned pesticides, and they're becoming discovered more often and more often in urban creeks. And we did find them at several sites. And so for FY11, we added some creek sites higher up the creeks so we could try and get closer to the potential sources and see if pyrethroids were a problem there. And we also added some testing for wildfire effects. And the results that we found, we didn't find any elevated levels of the compounds you would expect after a wildfire. But we did continue to find pyrethroids at Arroyo Burro Estuary in the Laguna Channel sediments, and then further up the watershed at Old Mission Creek at West Anapamu. So the other creek sites we didn't detect any at the other creek sites. And from that same sediment, we also tested toxicity and didn't find toxicity. We used a less sensitive test. There are more sensitive tests that can be done. So it looks like the pyrethroids are still not accumulating at levels that's high enough to be toxic to the aquatic organisms right then, but during storms they could be stirred up, and it's something we really need to keep abreast of and continue to do outreach on. And for storm monitoring, we sample several storms every year, but we always try and do the first flush, and that's the first storm of the year. And because pollutants have been accumulating on streets all year, and then the first storm usually doesn't produce too much rainfall. So it's a combination of a lot of material washing off of the streets, plus not too much rain to dilute it, and you get some of the highest concentrations of pollutants in the creek, so potentially the most harmful for the critters in the creek. And we always do our downstream, what we call integrator sites, the lowermost sites in the creeks that integrate the effect of any issues throughout the watersheds. And then for FY11, we added going further up and doing 4 storm drains. And actually, where we tested the storm drains was the water going into the storm drains right off the street, not the water coming out of the storm drain into the creek, because most of those are pretty difficult to get to during a storm. I actually did not sample. I cannot claim credit. Jim Rumbley, our water quality monitor and enforcement officer, was out from midnight till I think 4 in the morning or something. So thank you, Jim. And we tested for metals, pesticides, hydrocarbons, and toxicity tests. And we have a standard suite of pesticides that we've tested for years. And we usually don't get hits on those. And so I've really tried to find, what else should we be testing for? What other new pesticides are out there? And there's a state-funded group that finally put together a list of these are the recommended pesticides based on those that are used the most, sold the most persistent in the environment, and that have been detected at levels known to cause toxicity in other creeks. So we added to our list. And what we found is that while we did find some of the pyrethroids in 2009, we didn't find any this October. But we did find, and this is the first time we tested for pentachlorophenol, which is a wood preservative. So there's probably fence posts and fence boards all over town and that are preserved with compounds that can then run off during storms. And we found them at really low levels, and there aren't any set criteria, I don't think, for pentachlorophenol, so we don't know yet how much of a problem this could be. We'll continue to test and look into that. We also found we found the pentachlorophenol in every sample, creek and storm drain, and then we found some additional pesticides just in the water that was going into the storm drains. Chlordane, which is banned, I don't know where that's still coming from, Dacthal and malathion. And we'll continue to test. Now we know we can continue to test for those and see if we can find if it's a widespread problem. And then the metals and hydrocarbons were at low levels. Okay, and then the toxicity testing. So I've mentioned it a few times, but for those of you that don't know, what it is it's also called whole effluent testing or wet testing, different jargon. But we take usually about a gallon sample, send it to an outsourced lab, and then they expose that water to either a fish species or juvenile fish or an invertebrate like a water flea or some algae species, and then leave it in there with enough oxygen and all the other stuff they need for 4 or 5 days, and then see how many of those critters survive. And that's a % survival, and that gives us a sense of how toxic that water is. And there are creek samples in this storm and most other storms showed no toxicity except for Laguna Channel, and we have had toxicity there before because that really is just urban runoff. There's no dilution from the upper watershed. And then our drain samples were really highly toxic to the more sensitive species. So the creeks themselves, when and where we're testing, are not toxic. That's either that whatever's getting into the creek is diluted enough from rainfall that down there at those integrator sites, we're not having a problem. But we know we're putting material into the creek that is harmful to critters, and we haven't gone and then sampled right downstream of those storm drains. And it really only takes a couple hours of an organism getting exposed to high concentrations to cause problems. Another topic we've been concerned about, and I've spoken to you a little bit about this in the past, is the slurry sealing of streets. So this happens throughout the city every 5 to 8 years for each site. And it's basically like, in the sense, oiling the street. And so we've been concerned about the impacts of that. And we've done a pilot test, and then we did some additional testing last summer. We had a water quality intern and worked with Dr. Arturo Keller from UCSB. And we had some problems with our methods. So I hate to say it warrants additional study, but it does. But it does suggest that earliest runoff that we might get on these freshly sealed streets might be fairly toxic. And we're going to continue to look into that. We've only tested the public road slurry seal. We have not gone around and tested private parking lots. And those are like the really bright black. Sometimes they're redone every year or two. And from what I've heard, most of what's used in California is asphalt-based. And there's a whole other class of coal-based. And they're even more toxic. And so recently they were banned in a few cities in the U.S., and then Washington State was the first state to ban coal-based sealants throughout. And we've identified a pretty simple method to go around and test whether we might have some of that type of parking lot sealant that might lead to problems during rain events. So we'll pursue that. You can test. It's a pretty simple test to tell whether it's coal or asphalt-based sealant. And then just as a status update on our source tracking projects, with the UCSB, we have two projects, both grant funded. Our source tracking protocol, UCSB has delivered their final report. Now we still need to do some additional work and tie it into our final product. And then we have some really interesting results that we'll talk to you about towards the end of the year. And then our sewage sniffing dog project is now complete. That final report has been peer reviewed and published, and we've gotten a lot of interest, and it was a really neat project. And then last, I just wanted to, well, not last, but last of the updates, I wanted, some of you might have seen that Arroyo Burro was in the news for water quality a couple of weeks ago, and so I've talked to you about this at the last update, but I just wanted to reiterate that last summer had a really high number of beach warnings, and so we went at Arroyo Burro, and we went back and looked through the data, and and that's all in the FY10 report, and we could see that it really wasn't in the time since samples have been collected, it wasn't that unusual, and we probably had some indicator bacteria growth in the estuary and on the sand and on the decomposing kelp, but there wasn't anything unusual as far as any kind of sewage input last summer. And then this spring, especially since April 1st, we've had very few warnings, and only one of those was in dry weather. So things seem different this year so far. So finishing up with recommendations based on what we've learned. So we want to add some of for our sediment testing, we want to get right down below where the storm drains come into the creek. And that's where we might have some of the highest concentrations of things that are coming out of the drain and then sorbing onto sediment grains. So that'll be late summer sample collection. Sycamore Creek was listed by the State Water Board as impaired for salinity. And all of our creeks have naturally high salinity, but the State Water Board's position is this could be due to reclaimed water use or agriculture, something going on, fertilizers. So we need to do a creek walk and collect and do salinity testing from the headwaters down and see if is this just natural salt from the marine sediments that the creek is eroding through over time, or do we really have some kind of salinity inputs? Similarly, Mission Creek is listed for unknown toxicity, and we've been tackling this for years, and we had collected a lot of toxicity tests using the fathead minnow, which is what the State Water Board did also. Never found a problem with toxicity, and I really thought it was going to be delisted. And then they started testing with an algae species and they had toxic results with the algae species, and so we're going to do that too. And they only test down at the bottom. And I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if we have some herbicides in the creeks that we've never tested for that the algae is sensitive to. My hunch is that it's the hard water and our high salt content again. So we'll be taking toxicity tests from the upper watershed and the lower watershed and really trying to understand what's going on there. And then two other emerging issues are sumps being discharged. It's groundwater, fills up basement sump pumps, and then discharged to storm drains. And we know now some of those, this is partly from the work that Heal the Ocean did this year. We know now that some of those sumps are located potentially close to leaking underground storage tanks. And we just want to make sure that that water that's being pumped to the storm drains is not containing compounds that are at pollutants at high levels. And then we are going to do some preliminary testing of reclaimed water, recycled water that can be used for irrigation, and then the runoff gets into the creeks and test to see if there's any concern with pharmaceutical products. And there was just really pilot preliminary testing there. We have several projects to add to our project assessment list, our fish passage projects, the parking lot retrofit. I'm going to work with Autumn Malanka to do some testing of some post-construction BMPs. And then also there's the Mission Lagoon restoration project, so we'll be doing some baseline testing for that. And then the last thing we want to add is putting together a field test kit. So these methods would probably not be highly precise, but very helpful for the enforcement officer when he's out in the field and being able to test right on the spot for hydrocarbons or things that people might be discharging. And that's it. With that, I'll take any questions. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Next. The budget has not gone up much for our laboratory testing. We always try and kind of balance our questions so we're not just, as we add one thing, we'll usually try to finish up with something else. We're not making the costs go up and up. And then our next steps, we'll be carrying out the research plan, we'll continue to do our quarterly and annual reporting, and then come back in January for the annual report and focus more on our source tracking grant. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Great report. I've got a couple of questions, two specific questions and then a broader question. The rain event that rudely impinged on Betsy's spectacular event on June 5th, was that rain event the first event of the new season, or is that the last event of the old season in terms of when you're talking about the first flush? How do you define that? So if we have a rain late in the season, does that go for the old year or toward the new year?
That's the old year. So different agencies use a September 1st or an October 1st start date, and that might depend on the different weather patterns. The county, I think, starts counting again September 1st, so that's when we usually do.
Okay, thanks. And I remember when he was preceding Leanne French at the Brent School, our former councilman, Doss Williams, one of his projects was working with the creeks, and he remembered getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning to rush down and try to get first flush samples. Along the same way, in terms of distinguished Brent School graduates, was 2 of these projects that you were discussing in terms of data gathering, were those the ones that Stephanie Dolmott-Connell had worked on?
She worked on the Slurry Seal testing last summer. So that's the only one I think I mentioned of hers today.
Oh, okay, because I know she just graduated last week following in Leanne's distinguished footsteps, and she's going to be here, I think, at least till the end of the year. So if anyone needs to hire, just a super-duper Master's Brent student, couldn't do better than Stephanie. And then my last question, which I think is more open-ended, is I really appreciate the detailed overview of this report update. What would you, if you had to pick 2 or 3 things that really surprised you from the last time you briefed us, what would they be?
Well, the first was finding all those pesticides. We usually just keep testing and kind of keep looking for that needle in a haystack, and to get a lot of positive results was really surprising. They were at really low levels, so I'm going to be very curious what we'll find in the coming years. So there is one concern that if it was a new laboratory, they got a hit at every single sample, could that possibly have been contamination? So I think we'll have the answer to that next year.
Thanks for your report. I just have a few questions. When you're figuring out toxicity, you always use fathead minnows, or trout were used, or
in the early up until this year, we've used all fathead minnows, and that's what we were seeing that the regional water board and the Sea Camp and Swamp were using. And then as we started to see them recommend vertebrate, invertebrate, and algae, and we started doing some tests, like on the Slurry Seal, that might lead to more chronic toxicity, we started adding to our list of organisms. And so that first flush was the first time we'd ever tested for algae. But we're going to do some of that in dry weather as well.
Interesting. And when you're figuring out toxicity levels, are you basing it on MSDSs, or what are you using as a guide?
When we get a chemical result and then we try and assess whether that's toxic or not, we have a whole matrix of different criteria. Some of them are in the regional board's basin plan. Some of them are in the California Toxic Rule. Some of them are in the EPA's. They have a table of water quality criteria, so there are several sources. And then if anyone's interested, there's a great new resource on the State Water Board's site, buried. Feel free to email to ask for it, but they have compiled all criteria. But the MSDSs list specific tests that have been done, and it's really hard to interpret that.
And they're based on human toxicity levels, so that's why I'm asking the questions. I'm making sure that these are toxic for aquatics and not necessarily for humans, because what's not toxic for us will kill salmonids. So I want to see what you're using to determine the toxicity.
Yeah, we always select criteria that are relevant to the question.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Week before last, I believe I read in the LA Times an article about concern for fire retardant drops during the big brush fires in Los Angeles County. And from your report, I gather that we don't have that kind of problem here.
Member Castro, no, do not take that conclusion. I was testing for PAHs, which are combustion byproducts, and metals, which can come from high amounts of sediment running off.
Okay.
We were not testing for fire retardants. And it's interesting that you brought this up. The article was written referencing the Forest Service is going through a reevaluation of their policy on using retardant. And So I've learned more about that recently. But the retardant that they spray is called Phosgene, and the most toxic component that we know of, some of the components are proprietary, but the most toxic one that we know of is ammonia. And it has led to some fish kills. And when they do the aerial drops, they're supposed to stay 300 feet on either side away from any creek. But how do you define a creek in our watersheds?
And where does the fire go?
Exactly. So
Down
they're
creeks.
right. They're balancing there. But if you're interested, there's a whole public process on how to provide comments and learn more about that going on right now.
And just one other, do we or do we not have coal-based sealants present in Santa Barbara?
We don't know yet. For the street, the roads, the ones that the Public Works Department is hiring a private contractor to do, that's all asphalt based. But for the small private companies doing parking lots, I've heard through hearsay that coal sealant isn't available here. But I don't know that to be true. And so I definitely want to go and do some testing.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your report. But going back to the higher incidence of wood preservatives that you found, did you find any other chemicals that are commonly associated with wood curing or wood preserving? I know I had a case where there was a high correlation between arsenic and wood curing, so I was wondering if you had seen a higher incidence of any chemicals that may be related.
That's interesting. So arsenic and then possibly copper. I think copper is used, but we always find fairly high amounts of copper, and then our sediments and waters just have a naturally high arsenic level, so that would be really hard to tease apart. But I don't think we had any detections of arsenic in those samples. But don't quote me on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. That's interesting.
Mr. Jordan?
Sneak up and make a comment. I do feel cheated. There were no graphs and charts that I don't understand. I was at a meeting last night on the Mesa, standing room only of 75 people, and it kind of applies on one hand to the monitoring, but the relinquishment of Cliff Drive is stalled a little bit due to who's going to do what and who's going to pay for what. And Caltrans is working on an outreach program right now with the Mesa on what's called road diet, where the size of the Mesa of Cliff Road actually stays the same, but they restripe it. So they take it from parking and 2 lanes going each way and no median to a combination of parking, bike lanes, 1 lane each way, and a center left and right turning lane. And a couple of reasons I think it might be applicable for you guys to get involved is one, the area they're targeting is from Lighthouse Road downhill to the entrance to City College. And there might be some opportunities, one, to do some low-impact development as part of that. And in my world, as you know, it's always a constant defense on we test, and then what do we do with the testing, or what did the low-impact development do? This might also be an opportunity, if you look back on your color-coded watershed maps, there's that section of the Mesa is actually not in a watershed. There's a dead zone there where the water basically just hits a storm drain and runs the funnel to the ocean. It frequently just comes out of the side of the cliff and falls into the ocean. And so there might be some opportunities to combine some low-impact development and take some baseline monitoring and readings on what's going on before the low-impact development, and then do your development and then see what the improvements were afterwards as a means to showing the bang for the buck there. Okay, thanks.
Can I I want to follow up, Ms. Desmith, that I just checked the data, we didn't have any arsenic in any of those samples that had the pentachlorophenol.
Thanks, Dr. Murray. I have 2 questions. The first is referring to Mission Lagoon, and basically wondering if you have done testing there already, if so, what you found, or if not, what you would expect to find. And that's the first one. And the second question is, are there other alternatives to using animals in the testing?
first question, we have done a fair amount of testing in Mission Lagoon, but mostly related to indicator bacteria and beach warnings, and then some of our DNA-based source tracking. Some nutrients. Yeah, we did a series of quarterly testing where Mission Lagoon was one of the sample sites, so that included metals and hydrocarbons and pesticides and toxicity, and we didn't find any problems during dry weather there, except for nutrients. I would expect to find high nutrients, low dissolved oxygen, a lot of dissolved organic carbon, the kinds of signals that we have that there's a eutrophication problem, or the lagoon is getting too high a load of nutrients and leading to some water quality problems. That's one of the benefits of enlarging it. We'll probably see less of that. And then alternatives to animals. I've never looked into that. I mean, there's 3 tiers that you can think of as ways to assess water quality, and doing the chemical measurement is the first tier. You compare those against known criteria, but you're really looking at single compounds, and you're only seeing the compounds that you know to test for, and you don't really know how all of those effects might add up. And then the next tier is doing the toxicity testing, where you expose the water to one organism, and yes, there is some cultivation and dying of the test organisms. And then the next level is bioassessment, where you go out into the field and you say, what are all the critters here? Are these critters the type of do we have the organisms that are tolerant of pollution, or do we have the organisms that are really sensitive to pollution? And I think that the toxicity testing actually gives us the best bang for the buck as far as understanding water quality. And I'd like to hear more about your concerns.
Okay. Well, my concerns are just animal testing in general. If you know a certain range that the minnows from prior tests die at, is it necessary to replicate that year after year, time after time?
Well, yeah, well, and we're doing the algae also. We haven't, most of our water hasn't led to death of very many of the fish, but I'm sure that they don't they don't get released in the wild when they're done with the test either. So we do stop testing when we've answered the question. Like, we did a lot of dry weather testing on Arroyo Burro and Mission Creek. We did quarterly testing at multiple sites, and we had enough samples. We felt that we should be able to stop that testing and delist Mission Creek, and then we find there's additional methods. So we're not continuing to do much of the fathead minnow testing. So, yeah, in answer to that question, we aren't continuing to do the tests we don't feel that we need. But you've raised a good point that I had not even thought about.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's just I know that's a big consideration for many people. Are there any further questions from any of the members? Well, should we... do I have a motion? Oh, Lee?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, I would move, based on Dr. Murray's report, that we concur with the staff recommendation for the research plan for fiscal year 2012 with an appended recommendation that if our student committee member intern, Ms. Marroquin, hasn't had a chance to go out in the field when you're doing this testing, that you try to schedule a mutually convenient time so she can see about the environmental science behind your report.
So is that a motion to approve the recommendations?
Indeed it is, Mr. Chair.
I'll second.
Any questions or comments from any of the members? Then all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next item is Liz Smith with the Educational Outreach Program update.
Good evening, everyone. So, my name is Liz Smith. I'm the Creeks Outreach Coordinator, and I'm going to give you all a brief overview of our education and outreach efforts. So, just to start, our outreach programs are guided by the Creeks Division's Public Education Plan, as well as the city's Stormwater Management Program, or SWIMP, which I believe you heard about last month. The SWIMP includes measurable goals that we have to meet each year. And the main components of our program are youth education, community events, media outreach, internet-based outreach, and project and program outreach. A large component of our outreach efforts is youth watershed education, and the majority of that is contracted with Art from Scrap. In fiscal year 2010, they provided presentations to over 4,900 students, and this includes the Creek Kids series, which is made up of 2 in-class presentations and a field trip to a local creek, as well as the Watershed Resource Center down at Arroyo Burro Beach. And Art from Scrap also provides educational presentations and activities at many community events and school science nights throughout the year on our behalf. We continue to work with Youth Cinemedia, which is a local organization that provides training for at-risk teens on music and video production, graphic design, and photography. And over the past several years, they've created many English and Spanish language short films and PSAs, and print ads and bus ads, and a large banner that we use for all of our community events. So they do a lot of interesting, fun, youthful things for us. And we also incorporate youth education into our capital projects when possible. So for instance, with the Upper Las Positas Creek restoration, we built a bioswale on the Adams Elementary School campus. And over the last 2 years, approximately 600 students have participated in before and after observational visits to the site, art and poetry projects, native planting days, and water quality testing. And that area now serves as an outdoor classroom for the students that they use on a regular basis, which is great to have them out there experiencing nature. We partner with parks and recreation programs, for instance, working with RAP and AOK programs at Adams Elementary last year to provide after-school activities related to the bioswale. This summer, we'll be providing presentations to each session of Nature Camp, which starts next week for students, and so that might include field trips to the creeks, creek cleanups, and potentially native planting days. So we're still working on those details. We have also participated in the Youth Apprentice Program, where we hire teens to work during the summer on creek restoration projects. Last summer, they were removing non-native vegetation at Old Mission Creek at Bonnet Park, and they also installed 278 native plants. And some of you will recall in 2008, they built a bioswale, a different group of teens built a bioswale on Soledad Street, which is a great project that's still there and very visible and serving a great function. We also partner with the Morito program, which is multicultural education for resource issues threatening oceans. And so we meet up with Morito staff, usually down at Sycamore Creek, and bring elementary age students down to participate in water quality testing and native planting. And we've been doing that the past several years. And moving on to community events, each year we partner with the County of Santa Barbara, the cities of Goleta and Carpinteria, and many, many community organizations to put on Creek Week. During the 2010 event, 1,400 participants took part in 23 events, removed 5,000 pounds of trash from our creeks and beaches, and planted 311 native plants. And this year is the 12th annual Creek Week, which will begin September 17th, which is also Coastal Cleanup Day. And anyone who's interested in getting involved can visit sbcreekweek.com for some additional information. Each year, we host a community water quality forum. And last year, the forum featured Sable the sewage sniffing dog as part of the canine and microbial source tracking project that Jill briefly mentioned. Then also throughout the year, we partner with many different school groups, businesses, and community organizations to plan beach and creek cleanups, planting days, storm drain marking events, so just lots of different volunteer opportunities for the community. We also partner with the City Environmental Services Division's Looking Good Santa Barbara Community Cleanup. This year we worked with Channel Keeper, and we led a group of 6 volunteers to do a creek cleanup on Sycamore Creek. And you can see they had a lot of fun getting in the waders and tromping through the creek there. We administer the California Coastal Commission's Adopt a Beach program for the city of Santa Barbara. And in 2010, our groups spent 561 hours removing 3,400 pounds of trash and debris from our beaches. And then we also provide informational booths at many different community events throughout the year, which we feel provides a great opportunity to really talk to people one-on-one and help them understand what we do and why we do it. Our media outreach, we do a large amount of, running English and Spanish television and radio PSAs, English and Spanish print ads in local publications, as well as in and on MTD buses. Last year we worked with City TV to produce a series of television PSAs, and you can see our George Johnson up there on the top surfing in the storm drain. And that particular PSA was nominated for a regional Emmy, so we're pretty excited about that. I think the winner is announced this weekend, so cross your fingers for us. And then we also place ads occasionally in local high school and elementary school publications, and we also place an ad in the city's recreation guide, which is published twice a year. Our internet outreach centers around our website, which provides a wealth of information about all of our projects and programs. We received just almost 7,000 visitors in 2010 compared to 4,000 in 2006, which was the first year that we have statistics for. Each month we send out an email newsletter to 549 subscribers, which provides volunteer opportunities and events and updates on our projects and programs. We have done a little bit of online advertising. We haven't really jumped into that too much, but most recently we placed an ad on independent.com that related back to the Ocean Begins on Your Street campaign. And then we also promoted last year's Creek Week on newshawk.com. So we're trying that out a little bit. Haven't really gotten too much going. In January of this year, we created a Facebook page as a way to reach people, again, just on a more one-on-one basis and provide more frequent updates than people who are only signed up for the e-news or not signed up for any outreach from us. Hopefully they get interested and follow us. And then we also created a YouTube channel to share videos related to our programs. For our project and program outreach, we have the Clean Water Business Program. And this just began in 2007, and we have had a total of 106 restaurants, automotive businesses, and mobile washers certified so far. The businesses who are certified receive a sticker to go in their window and a certificate that they can display at their place of work. And they can also participate in our business assistance program, where we purchase equipment for them so that they can meet water quality regulations and become certified. We promote the program itself, and then we also promote those businesses in print ads and online. The program we promote by sending postcards through the mail to specific business segments that we would like to reach, cold calls, a quarterly automotive newsletter, enforcement actions, and community events. Our Creek Tree program is also relatively new, and we have tried promoting that through direct mailings and community events, but the most successful approach has been having our Creeks intern go door to door to Creekside residents and just talk to people about the program. And our intern's work led to 4 projects being installed over the past year, and then we have several others that are in the planning stages. So our intern did a great job there. As we are working on capital projects, we have a lot of opportunity to get the community involved through meetings, volunteer opportunities, project tours, ribbon cutting ceremonies, and then following the project completion, we install interpretive signage just to help inform anyone who happens by the site. And finally, creek signs and storm drain markers are kind of long-term projects. The creek signs are found on pedestrian and auto bridges in the Mission, Sycamore, and Arroyo Burro watersheds. And then the storm drain markers are on curb drains throughout the city. And that also provides a volunteer opportunity. And you can see we have a couple of young people out replacing a storm drain marker. And that, in turn, those bright orange vests, people are always asking the volunteers what they're doing. So then the volunteers can help educate others, which is a great bonus. So with that quick overview, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Chair, Liz, I think that's a very impressive overview of all the different projects and programs the Creeks Division is carrying forward in partnership with other agencies and other community groups. I want to give you like a tetherball question, and I know the chair gets this periodically, and we all do. If we were among the more frugal members of the Lodging and Restaurant Association who are helping to levy the Measure B tax. Could you explain to the people in the audience and the people who are watching from home how all these different outreach and education programs help move us towards the goal of cleaner creeks and beaches?
Thank you, Mr. Moldiva. So I think that the biggest thing is just awareness. One, that the creeks are there. Also that the storm drains are there and the function of the storm drains. And we have seen in our surveys that people are unsure about the role of the storm drain. And so teaching students, youth about the function of the storm drain, getting volunteers out, it really helps drive that point home that this water is not treated. So that's a big one. Do you want to elaborate?
Sure. I would start off by noting that in Santa Barbara, like many urban communities across the country, the number one source of pollution for surface waters and creeks and at the beaches is that urban runoff. It's non-point source pollution. We don't just have some factories here where we can go and address a single pollution source at a time. It's really coming from everyone in the community. And so in order to have a positive impact on water quality, we need to communicate with everyone in the community so that they understand that they're potentially part of the pollution source, and their behaviors and their actions can actually help improve water quality. And it's a really significant undertaking to try to reach people and make that part of their consciousness, so they realize that the things they see in the streets and on the sidewalks and in the parking lots and rooftops and so forth, when it rains or when we have sprinkler irrigation overspray, that water carries those pollutants down into the creeks. So we want to try to address the problem at its source, and since the source is the entire community is part of the solution.
So you mean that educating the children at the Adams School and the volunteers on the other projects and local businesses will create then the base and the momentum for sustainably clean creeks as people learn not to pollute them, something like that? Right. What I'd say about the thanks for the softball, what I'd add about the young people is non-point source pollution is sort of an equal opportunity. It doesn't matter what age you are. You can be just as much a part of the problem as a kid as you can as an older person. And so we do a lot of targeted outreach in places that we're going to reach different segments of the community. Our stormwater permit with the state requires us to do a survey of the community about every 5 years or so we can kind of, that's our test to see how we're doing and how we're reaching people. It also shows us where we're not reaching people and who we need to target the next time around. So.
Hi, Liz. I'm now out at the university, and there's two groups of college students who join environmental media classes. One's called Blue Horizons, and one is called Green Screens. And the students that are involved in those classes are charged with developing an environmental film and in the local community. So if you're ever thinking you want some college level engagement on some of these issues, I know you've already got some groups looking at media, youth media involvement, but I certainly could put you in contact with the leaders of those two programs at school and foster a dialogue for the coming years, because the students are always looking for interesting subjects that can also be cool. So.
Yeah. No, that would be great. And one group actually this past year interviewed Cameron. They did a film about the steelhead restoration efforts. So we know a little bit about them. We haven't really partnered with them quite yet.
Okay, great.
Part of the festival last year.
I think these are all great well-rounded ways to educate the public. One question is with the Creek Kids series and the Watershed Resource Center field trips, does the program contact schools or the schools like contact the actual program?
The program puts flyers out to all the teachers and all the schools and contacts them, and then a lot of times we get the teachers calling Art from Scrap to schedule. They work directly with Art from Scrap, and sometimes they'll contact me and I direct them to Art from Scrap. So there's kind of a good back and forth.
I definitely feel like this should be seen in a lot of the high schools, because whenever I think of like the watershed, I remember like going to elementary school, and then after that it's just
it is
not
available.
much.
Definitely the field trips to the Watershed Resource Center are available up through 12th grade, so I don't think that they do as much outreach necessarily to high school age students, but we definitely get all of the elementary schools involved. And one college group this past year, so that was great.
Thank you.
I just have one question, Liz. The beaches and creeks that are involved in the cleanup, are these also the same creeks that our contractors go through and clean? Do you know this?
Yes, definitely. Jim Rumbly sends out our contractor, I think weekly or bi-weekly, to go and clean the creeks and some beach spots. There's definitely some overlap. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll have Jim have the contractor not go out if we know a cleanup group is going to be going in the next day or two, so that they can get a real feel for what is in the creeks and what we're finding. So
have you ever looked into advertising at movie theaters? You know how many ads we have to see when we sit before we actually get to the movie that we paid to go see? But I don't know if any of the local theaters would be willing to donate a bit of airtime, like to the commercial that you mentioned that had been nominated, or if you've looked into that at all.
You know, since I've been here, we haven't done that. I don't know if we have in the past. We've talked about it a bit.
I know we looked into that in the past. The theater was not, the theater company was not willing to do free public service announcements because I think there's enough demand for their advertising, and we looked at the audiences we were trying to reach as a result of our survey, and we didn't know if we would get as much bang for our buck there as we would in other places. But I wouldn't take it off the table permanently, because we're always looking for ways to reach new audiences that we haven't gotten the message out to. So it's certainly something that we've considered and is still on the radar for us.
Good. And I don't know if we end up winning this award over the weekend, if even the SB Film Festival would consider airing it before one of their flicks next year, or if it's just an area to look into where you have a captive audience.
Great idea. Thanks.
You mentioned the survey was every 5 years, did you say?
We did one initially in 2002, and then we did a follow-up in 2008, and so we're tentatively looking at 2013 for the next one.
So was the 2008 one where you guys instructed to focus on kids primarily? Was that your main
No, that has been around since the 2002. When the public education plan was developed, it really emphasized children as an important group to reach out to, just because hopefully they can grow up being environmentally minded, and then also they can help educate their parents. So that's an important element.
The survey is a telephone survey, so we don't actually survey children for that. I don't even know if that's legal to do that. So the surveys are with adults. We do the surveys in English and Spanish. We work with a professional surveying company, so we're able to use cell phones as well as landlines, and we have a mixture. As I said, they're English and Spanish. We do our TV and radio and print commercials in English and Spanish. One of the target demographics for us was I can't remember the age group, young Latinas, and we are doing some advertising, I think, with Univision for novellas. Is that right?
Yeah.
Soap operas.
Telenovelas, yes.
Telenovelas. And we work with the Univision advertising representatives to match up. You know, they've got their demographic information and numbers of people who are watching those kinds of shows, and so we try to match that up with what our needs are.
Just one more. In response to Jim Rumbley's presentation last month, I called Jim and reported 2 situations I had observed, one on Stearns Wharf and then one off of Alomar, where a taco truck was cleaning out their waste into a drain. And within 2 days, Jim reported back to me that he had spoken with the property owners, the owners of the restaurant, and the situation was corrected. So if the public has a concern, observes a problem, call
897-2688.
Thanks.
And if you're not sure, call, because Jim is always welcome to let you know what is and isn't legal and always willing to investigate. So.
All right, Ms. Sith, thank you very much. That was
Thank
great.
you.
Any other further announcements anyone wants to make?
I was wondering if Cameron and Jen, before I move to adjourn, could give us some idea of the time and place of the next meeting for those in the audience and watching at home.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Moldaver. The next meeting will be Wednesday, July 20th, and it will be at the City Council Chambers, 5:30 p.m.
July 20th at the City Council Chambers. So that'll make it easier for Mr. Armstrong to attend again, based on the excitement that he sensed today. With that information, would the chair object if I move to adjourn?
And do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Aye.